All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome once again to a new OSPology session. Today the topic is about governance in the context of compliance and security. And today we have here Zane from the OpenChain project. But before starting with his presentation and sharing more insights about him, I would like to share with you some OSPO news. And I'm gonna share my screen right now. Hold on for a second. All right. Here we go. So we will first introduce some of the OSPO news that has been happening during this month. And then we will move forward to the topic of the day that, as I said, is the governance in the context of compliance and security. And then we will stop this recording and we will move into intros and a group discussion. So first of all, we had new OSPO adopters and tutor members this month. So we have Boeing as a new OSPO adopter and Goldman Sachs as the new tutor members. You can go and check it in the landscape at tutorgroup.org. So next, we also had new OSPO discussions and articles coming from SAP and Goldman Sachs. SAP recently published article about how SAP manage open source software in an OSPO, and Goldman Sachs recently shared about open source program office and the work done at the tutor group. Also, we have some discussions in the new OSPO forum in the GitHub repo. And the new entries are about policies or framework to manage participation in tech conferences, how to manage software bill of materials for open source projects, and measuring open source framework and adoption. Another new thing, we are trying to bring communities together to work collaboratively in this OSPO ecosystem and try to build an OSPO framework and infrastructure. So for that reason, we are sharing these OSPO associates programs to try to bring collaboration and help accelerate innovation and digital transformation through open source program offices. And hopefully, we can try to working together and with all the different communities, we can try to define better all the different stages and pillars where the different OSPOs usually works at in safety, education, engagement, and leadership. And communities that has expertise on the different areas can add more value to the OSPO community. And of course, having in mind all these industry cultural gap, all the legal barriers, and the size of the team and the organization. And last but not least, you might want to know, hey, what if you are new to OSPology sessions, what is this? And can I contribute? Can I contribute to this? So the answer is yes. We have everything is in a repo, in a GitHub repo. It's public. And people can go ahead there and propose topics, offer to become a speaker, take part in the voting process for upcoming topics, and also improve documentation. And I've shared with you the link there if you want to take a look. So let's move now to the topic of the month that, as I said, is governance in the context of compliance and security. And today we have with us Zane Kogan, that is the OpenChain General Manager. And he has an extensive knowledge of open source governance, internal process development, supply chains management, and community building. His experience includes engagement with the enterprise, embedded, mobile, and automotive industries. So, Shane, first of all, thank you so much for coming and for giving this presentation today. I'm gonna keep sharing the slides. Just let me know when you want me to move to the next one, and I will do so.
Would it be okay if I took over the share for the slides?
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and you can share your own.
Okay,
yeah, that's perfectly
wonderful.
fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So I've just asked it to give me sharing permission, and I will hopefully be able to share my slides in a second. So everyone, it's obviously great to be here, and I'm very glad to be able to speak to you today. Oops, the share went down again. I'm going to full screen my slides. Are my slides full screen at the moment? Alrighty. Okay, so some of you are familiar with the OpenChain project and some of you are probably not. What we're going to do is to explain very briefly what OpenChain is and then move on to what's happening right now in the context of this year. And that will, of course, touch on security, which is affecting all of the projects in the Linux Foundation, but especially those like To-Do Group, like OpenChain, like SPDX, which are at the forefront of helping people manage software. So OpenChain is a project that manages an ISO standard. This is the ISO standard for open source license compliance. This particular standard was created quite a few years ago and was designed as a de facto industry standard initially. The idea was to work on making the supply chain more trustable. So we've had a situation in the supply chain where individual companies have tended to go their own way on compliance matters. And this has led through natural friction to issues with compliance. When you're dealing with 20 or more companies to get a product through the supply chain and everyone's doing their own thing, it's obviously going to be an imperfect solution. The OpenChain project wrote a specification. It was collaboratively written by over 100 contributors. And this particular specification defines the inbound, internal, and outbound inflection points where we know something has to be done to avoid errors around open source license compliance. You'll immediately infer from this that identification on inbound, internal, and outbound regarding software syncs neatly with security as it does. Now, our ISO standard defines on a company-by-company basis where to put process inflection points, but the goal is to link up the supply chain and for the companies to all coalesce around this standard. When we started in 2016, it was an early stage industry standard, and now, of course, it's a formal ISO standard and has quite a lot of traction. We're very happy about that progress. The OpenChain project itself is extensive in terms of community. If my slide is displaying correctly, you'll be able to see a list of the global work groups we have. We've got a main work group that has been operational since spring 2016. And we've built out from that specification editing, conformance management, curriculum building, specialized groups on automotive and tooling and telco, and a group working on educational material. The scope of engagement in the OpenChain project is hard to quantify, except to say it is of massive scale. By way of example, we've got a local geographic presence in many areas around the world with country-specific work groups. And in certain areas, such as Germany, Japan, Korea, China, India, Taiwan, we've got engagement in the local language with local participants in each region, 100 or more, allowing us to spread knowledge from external and to bring it from internal matters and essentially level up everyone in the world regarding how we address compliance matters. The community, when the world is not stopped with a pandemic, meets frequently. Our local work groups tend to meet about once every 2 to 3 months, and our global work groups meet more frequently, bi-weekly for the general global meetings and It depends on the other work groups when they meet, but tooling also meets bi-weekly. And we have a pretty hectic schedule, given that we have thousands of people from, as far as we can tell, over 1,000 companies involved. Now, the potential of bringing all of these people together to deal with compliance is large, but we have to judge the outcome of the OpenChain project, as with all things, on the realization of that potential. So we brought people together to work on open source license compliance. We built a standard that gained enough traction to become an ISO standard. But to what extent has it realized the potential of shifting the supply chain as a whole? Well, let's have a look at some of the conformance announcements since we became an ISO standard in December of last year. We're just hitting our first birthday. We kicked off with announcements from Toyota and NTT Data and Cisco straight off the bat. And as we started the year, we had companies like Microsoft, LG Electronics, and Hitachi announce their adoption of the ISO standard. And this has continued pretty consistently throughout the year. Bosch, by the way, is an interesting example. Most companies set up a compliance program. Bosch is actually targeting the entire entity to be using OpenChain everywhere by the end of the year. And so on, we continued. I liked our traction in some areas. Like once we had Woven Planet, that was like a high-tech future part of Toyota. QCT, of course, is data centers. We got SK Telecom as our first major telco. They've got 54% of the Korean market. Eclipse Foundation was an interesting one. Most of our conformance is corporate, but this was project-based, and all of the Eclipse processes for development now meet the ISO standard requirements. And NEC, of course, conformed recently, and that's pretty nice. It's a bit of a segue into what Anna talked about. Boeing engaged with To-Do Group. NEC is also involved in aviation and defense, and we're glad to enter that market. Now, as well as having these tentpole conformance things, we've got a whole bunch of smaller companies adopting this standard. And as you can imagine, the tentpole announcements tend to encourage other participants in the supply chain to get involved. And that's no bad thing. One of the cool parts of setting this new ISO standard has been how it's influenced other parts of standardization around the world. So for example, Scania, an automotive company based in Sweden, part of the Volkswagen Group, recently announced that OpenChain and SPDX, one of our sister projects and a sister ISO standard, are now part of a Scania corporate standard for procurement. The reason I'm bringing this up is that we're coalescing on the process management interoperability, the process management frictionless state that we really need. When it comes to supporting people to adopt OpenChain, we have lots of ways of doing that. We have online self-certification in 12 languages. We have extensive reference material from training slides through to open source policy templates through to guides on automation. And indeed, we have a corpus of information contributed from all over the world in many different languages and translated into many different languages. We have over 1,000 documents in a reference library online. And that ranges from official material, like supplier guides that teach people what is open source, through to community material, which may have been contributed by, let's say, a vendor which had information they were sharing with their clients and decided to pass to our reference library. Cool thing about this is we put everything, whoops, what happened there? We put everything under CC0, effectively public domain. And this, of course, means that people can take this information and they can include it in their own training material and do whatever they want. We had particular early lessons in the impact of that with our training slides, which were built out of contributions from Qualcomm, Samsung, ARM, and Philips Electronics, and then contributions additionally from almost 100 other companies. Those slides went out into the world and went far beyond our project and far beyond our standard. They've turned up all over the place in everything from commercial services through to internal training materials, and we just love the impact that can have. But it's a long tail. It's not the core. When it comes to the core of stuff, as we try to make sure people can adopt this ISO standard, we do various things like we have a supplier education pack. I mentioned a moment ago that we have a a leaflet that tells people what is open source. The supplier education pack has a few of these documents in one attachment, and it's designed that you can take this and send one email to your suppliers, and they go from understanding what is open source to what is compliance management, what is the ISO standard for compliance, and how to adopt it. So it's a one email solution, currently available in 8 languages, which is a good start. We are covering some of the most important markets regarding the supply chain, of course, with simplified and traditional Chinese and Vietnamese. And we're pretty happy with the impact of that. What may be a little more juicy for the audience today is that we've continued to build out material to help people regarding our standard and other domains. Now, OpenChain is the ISO standard for license compliance, but as I previously mentioned, it has fantastic overlap with security requirements. If people are using the OpenChain process inflection points, they're covering a lot of the bases they need for security. Our community was cognizant of this and indeed began using OpenChain for security purposes. To help with that response to market demand, we made a security assurance reference guide. And this guide essentially looks at our ISO standard and says, these are the bits that are directly relevant to security if you want to use this ISO standard to assist you with your security. Now, this type of work is part of a bridging activity, which I think will become increasingly important in 2022. I mentioned our sister standard SPDX, which is a software bill of materials. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. OpenChain is a process standard. To-do group addresses how you manage your open source program office. We all interlink, and from a larger perspective, ISO standards like OpenChain, ISO standards like SPDX interlink with other standards, including security standards and so on and so forth. One of the advantages of our positioning in our large community is that we can help bring people into a domain like security and help guide them into engagement with the standards that suit them. And their pathway can start with something like the Security Assurance Reference Guide if they need it. And we purposefully work to interoperate with what other people are doing. So if people start using OpenChain for security, and then they move into other security standards, they won't find any contradictions. We're all getting closer and closer. The ideal result of our future activities will be that you'll have zero distance between standards as you accomplish your various goals, and you can move from one to the other practically organically. Right. We are up to a lot of stuff. I mentioned we have our ISO standard, we have our big community, and we have tons of reference material. Now, we had feedback from the market that it's all very well to define what needs to be done and to have some reference material which can help inspire you. But the gap in the middle is where most companies in the supply chain are falling down. So when it comes to implementation modeling, most companies are not sophisticated. And this applies to open source license compliance, it applies to security, it applies to virtually everything. Through no fault of their own, companies are working with limited team sizes, extremely tight budgets, and brutally short timelines. We've recently been working on addressing that, and we're building out playbooks, which will first be formally published on the 16th of December at the Open Compliance Summit, that show people how a company, like a small company, mid-size, or large company, might think through compliance from first principle. And for instance, the playbook says, bring together a few people into a virtual or actual OSPO and do an assessment of where your company is. And once you have that assessment done, here's how you can think through options for the future. And of course, the playbooks are designed to be a wargaming of sorts, and they are a story of how an imaginary company did this based on our knowledge in the market. We're pretty optimistic that this will help fill one of the gaps in the supply chain, which will also assist in domains like security. As companies try to work out what to do, how do I make those decisions? What are my options? We're doing our best. One of the things that I think will be helpful for the market is that we've started to build personas. for these different companies, which are more or less relatable depending on who's reading the documents and what company size they're reading about. But the idea is that these personas can over time be fleshed out and used in other contexts, whether it's security, whether it's export control. And these items are all on our radar at the OpenChain project. And naturally, we'll be working with the other projects in LF and beyond to realize this. First release, December 16th. Now, there's a lot more happening. It looks like our first online training course for this ISO standard will be available around December 16th too. And next year, we'll go into more detail about compliance management. As I mentioned before, the inflection points we're talking about are also very useful for security. So we do expect that in our domain, a lot of our companies which have compliance personnel engaging with us will also send security personnel to kick the tires on some of this stuff and to see how thinking through that might help them as well. Let's talk about where OpenChain is at right now. So these are our current Platinum members. These are the governing board members of the OpenChain project. And as you can see immediately, it's a very diverse set in terms of industry and in geography. We are truly a global project, which is why I'm here at 1 a.m. in Japan talking to you. We're spread across the world, and we have some very useful market domain knowledge and support because of that. The diversity that you see of our members is reflected in the broader community again. So if you're looking at somewhere like China, we've got 120 odd people from about 100 companies involved, and the companies are just as diverse as this. It's useful, and it bridges a lot of information that goes beyond open source license compliance. That allows us to look at other things. It's the reason that, for example, we have been able to work on the security domain. It's the reason we're building playbooks that are designed to be extendable into other areas. We get a lot of market intelligence. We're very fortunate to have that. We've seen some great Platinum member growth in the last year. Ericsson and Huawei both joined. Both, of course, are telco companies, and both from interesting geographies with Europe and China. We've, I think, benefited from having these type of companies come on board, provide new perspectives, particularly around things like how wireless networking developments, the imperatives of that industry, and open source. And of course, OpenChain is, if you look at the previous slide, there's 21 companies with our board. We have more companies asking to join the board. So right now, one Chinese, one Japanese, and one American multinational are in discussions about joining our board as well, which gives us potentially one of the largest boards in the Linux Foundation. We are fortunate, though. Our board is very much aligned on our mission, and our mission is clear-cut. There's only one standard for open source license compliance, and there is full consensus on how we bring it to market. Now, user communities are all very well, and having great diversity is a huge strength. But one of the things that comes up from the user communities is that we also need to have a situation of being able to get commercial support around the ISO standard. And there's two ways this can happen. One is in the general ISO support structures. There's tons of companies out there who can help you with adopting an ISO standard, certifying, and so on. The other way is to have vendors which collaborate closely with the project and therefore are engaged with it in a way that might not be visible to parties which are further away from us. And we have a partner program to accomplish exactly that. In blue, you can see where our partners are currently geographically based, but their coverage is global. And some of those partners, law firms, of course, are prevalent. We've got quite a few international law firms, most recently Marx & Clerc in France, opening a new domain for us there. We have a bunch of service providers, which is our catch-all generally for companies that provide consultancy or other similar services. Some of these parties are huge, like Wipro or Synopsys, and some of them are much smaller, bespoke firms, which provide targeted support for people. What we can say is that all of our partners, whether it's Source Code Control in the UK or Meta Effect in Germany, are cognizant of the project, cognizant of our goals, and support us in that beyond simply having product sales, which of course is our target. When it comes to tooling, we have, I think pretty much everyone now is an OpenChain partner, and they provide, of course, services which help people automate around compliance management. Proviso here, OpenChain also spends a lot of time talking about how you can do automation with open source tools. And that's something I'll come back to in a second. We have third-party certifiers as well. So we have everything from CAICT, which is an entity under the Chinese Ministry of Trade, through to PwC, which of course is traditionally an accounting firm, but is a global service provider as well. Third-party certifiers of an ISO standard are able to actually take you through the whole process, issue a certificate, and they take responsibility for you being properly certified. This is different from self-certification or independent assessment, but all are equally valid. I mean, if a company looks at the spec or does our online self-certification questionnaire, they're OpenChain conformant if they think they are. If they meet those requirements of the spec, and if they can show how and why they did it to their customer companies. Equally so, if a company gets third-party certification, they have a third party check it over and help them set up the processes, and they become conformant too. It depends on market sector. It depends on where you are in the supply chain, what matters most for you. Our third-party certifiers are global, and we're looking forward to announcing our first Japanese entity, which is also a global multinational, very soon. Right. Tons of community, tons of vendors. What else? So we've been quite busy on the policy front, and this goes beyond OpenChain itself. I mean, we're the first ISO standard for open source compliance, and that kind of fits into a larger domain than license compliance. We're leading the way in showing open source codifying the knowledge we've built over 20 years. And as part of that, we've engaged with governments. So for example, the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry included OpenChain in guidance policy last year. And they also included our sister project, SPDX. And this policy, of course, impacts government planning and also national infrastructure provider planning. We've also had engagement, of course, in the United States with NTIA as they discuss software bill of materials and the executive order regarding cybersecurity. Software bill of materials, of course, front and center is SPDX. OpenChain is a process standard. It's kind of a higher level standard. But OpenChain helps identify the points where you want a software bill of materials and why. So we're all interlinked, and we've had engagement there alongside our colleagues at SPDX. China, same deal. We, of course, have CAICT, part of the Chinese Ministry of Trade, is now an OpenChain certifier. We also are engaging with China Electronic Standardization Institute, another section of the Ministry of Trade, who are pretty active in also promoting OpenChain. We're very glad about that. And Open Atom Foundation, which is a national open source body, similar in concept to Linux Foundation or Eclipse, focused mostly on internal stuff and elsewhere. We've been talking with BSI in the UK, DIN in Germany. Particularly of interest to the traditional standardization parties is how global communities in areas like open source have coalesced and built new de facto standards that then matured to the extent of being ready to become ISO standards. And that's where we also have a lot of fun. For example, OpenChain was at the C++ Standards Committee meetings at 2020, 2021. They've been really progressive in thinking through how the market is evolving and how de facto standards are maturing. Most importantly, how the standards are made in new ways and why some of these ways can be illustrative. And in the opposite way, how more traditional ISO structures can help nascent communities learn what to do more effectively. It's great to work with these people, and we're looking forward to deepening that. So OpenChain has been busy. First part of our work was phase 1, writing the spec, and that was around 2016. Once we had the spec ready, we went to market around October 2016, and then we were in phase 2, bringing it to market. A few iterations, particularly around things like making language more simple for people who are using English as a second language, clarifying some concepts based on market realities. And then we got to a state around April 2019 where there was nothing left to do. The standard was increasingly going out in the market, everyone was happy, and we were done. So that's when we went into the process of kicking the tires, making sure everything was really done. And April 2020, we went into a fast-track process at ISO, where mature, no longer needing editing standard converts from de facto into a formal standard. Phase 3, we're in it right now since December last year, is bringing this standard to every part of the supply chain. So we reduce uncertainty, we increase trust, and of course, we make everything more efficient and cheaper. There will be more standards coming out of open source. We have de facto specifications in several areas. There will be projects which are in a position to learn, and we're very fortunate to have the Joint Development Foundation as part of the Linux Foundation now. It's one of our projects. And the Joint Development Foundation is designed to help projects understand how to go towards formal standardization. Okay, so it can help you either improve where you're at today, or if you're already mature, go forward and perhaps become an ISO standard. It's a very exciting concept because open source, personal opinion, has for too long been based on kind of doing stuff and assuming that we now know how it's done, it's in the code and it's in the written document, and that's fine. Formalizing things through ISO is very important when you have to think about going not to thousands of companies, but going to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of companies over decades. And that's why something like OpenChain was particularly suitable. You know, license compliance is license compliance. Once you define the process inflection points, it's not like there's going to be a sea change on that. And of course, to be honest, the market has been pretty much ready to mature, particularly in our domain around governance. And I'm not talking about project governance, I'm talking about corporate governance, of addressing things like our legal requirements, addressing things like our most effective supply chain management. In the Linux Foundation alone, we've had the Open Compliance program, which has brought together things from OpenChain, SPDX, through to tooling and other items directly related to that domain. We've had events like the Open Compliance Summit, which will next take place on December 16th, which allow everyone to come together once a year to talk about license compliance, export control, security, whatever is under that umbrella of compliance and open source, in a manner that is amenable to freely speaking. It's under Chatham House rule, so everyone can talk freely without it being a case of, you know, someone saying, oh, Bob from Google said A. And this has led to a great amount of knowledge sharing. And of course, fundamentally, where we're at today is based on 20 years of work. So Linux Standard Base was out as a de facto standard in 2001. And it eventually became an ISO standard in 2006. Linux Standard Base was, I think, the first great indicator of open source reaching a certain type of maturity in the market. And now it's obsolete, and that's fine. But that was a milestone. And after that milestone, we knew with great certainty that enterprise open source was solid and that you could invest in open source for decades at a time. Now we're at the point in the market where we're standardizing optimal governance methodologies like OpenChain, like SPDX. And you know, we're sort of happening suddenly after 20 years. Right. So what else is going on? One thing that I mentioned a couple of times was the scale of the OpenChain community. And that has led us to having quite a lot of influence in adjacent domains. And it allows us to contribute back to other projects around the Linux Foundation. So when discussions about OSPOs happen in Japan, we can point at To-Do Group. When discussions happen about software bill of materials, we can finesse that and talk with SPDX. Indeed, SPDX 2.2 that became the ISO standard actually had part of it, one of the appendices, appendices 7, SPDX Lite, a minimal subset, created by the OpenChain Japan community for the Japanese supply chain. Those type of things happen a lot. And the most recent thing we're doing is looking at open source compliance automation. And this is focused on looking at open source tools for open source compliance, using some very handy glue technology from TNG Germany and Facebook, which is a graphical user interface that allows us to call lots of the different open source projects that do compliance scanning. We've been running the case study between September and December. We've covered a lot of ground, most recently a virtual supply chain showing how multiple different tools can be used with SPDX to have coherent compliance data in our supply chain without people needing to have expensive external tools or unusual amounts of knowledge or effort. That's one really cool thing that's happening. Another cool thing that's happening is that we're taking all of this global community and bringing it together at the Open Compliance Summit this year, using our deep tentacles to try to bring as much really interesting knowledge as possible to the table. And I think our schedule for this year, as I said, December 16th, go see it, is probably the best yet in terms of the scope of information we're covering. And of course, I've mentioned it several times, working with our sister projects like SPDX, as they do things like become an ISO standard or set up new international communities, has been a real pleasure. And it's very important that we can do this. I remember when OpenChain became an ISO standard, we had some questions come in from new entrants. They were like, so it's an ISO standard, but it's an open source community. Yes. Does that mean you're going to change the standard all the time? No. We have no intention of updating OpenChain for half a decade or so. SPDX, I think, might iterate a little bit more quickly, but that's the nature of what they are. We're a process standard. They're a software bill of materials. And what's really cool is now that SPDX is an ISO standard, and in domains like the OpenChain community, people are already using it quite a lot, we should see dramatically improved interoperability between tooling, whether open source or proprietary, on the compliance automation front. Right, ending up. The OpenChain project is run by user companies. All of our board members are user companies. They're not vendors. All of our vendors are in the partner program. And this means that we are the people solving the problems for us. And I think that's why the community is so healthy. It's a very clear, very fair, very egalitarian community, because fundamentally, we all need the supply chain to be more efficient. I mentioned it a couple of times. When it comes down to it, this isn't really about legal matters. I mean, license compliance, yes, licenses are a legal domain, but what we're dealing with in business intelligence is the cost in resources and time. And we want that to be as close to zero as possible while meeting all of our requirements. We're basically seeking efficiency in the supply chain. And it's very interesting how we can manage to get both efficiency and accuracy with things like a good ISO standard and with a healthy community to support people as they adopt it. Now, one of the last things I'd bring up is the sustainability issue. Security and license compliance, when you get past the I'm taking my product to market right now moment, when you look at the long tail, that's where the really interesting things happen. Without known and reproducible processes and policies and training, without good records, we have no idea what went to market a couple of years ago. And even if we do know roughly what it is, we probably can't find things like the build scripts and source material to fix it if there's a compliance error or a security error. One of the major contributions beyond efficiency right now, I think, will be sustainability, in that when you are using OpenChain, by definition of our standard itself, you're going to have records of what software you were using. You know, what was it? Where did it come from? What version? What license? And that will solve a lot of the domain issues around license compliance, but also security, export control, and other types of things. Going as far as merger and acquisitions and venture capital, where we already see OpenChain being utilized as a sort of health test of how the last few years of a startup have gone. Right, what happens next? OpenChain is obviously going to continue promoting OpenChain. And that's going to go on for a long time. But we're also going to be leveraging our position, our scope, in terms of being a thought leader and market influencer for everyone's benefit. And what that means is we're going to continue advocating for increased cooperation. We're going to try to bring more and more people together, especially on things like having OSPOs in place. It's something that's peaking in the market. It's coming into play, but a lot of the supply chain has a lot to learn. And it's great to be able to work with Anna on this, because I think, especially in areas like China, especially in areas like the Japanese long-tail supply chain, companies are going to need more and more information, support, and collaboration. And that's one thing that OpenChain can bring to the table, and we're looking forward to it. We obviously have a lot to do, not just on license compliance, but also in making sure that security is addressed. And this goes far beyond the US and its executive order. All around the world, different governments are doing different things, but we all ultimately coalesce on a simple fact. Everything is software. And software has not been efficiently managed for the concept of making sure security today and security tomorrow, or sustainability today and tomorrow, was fully addressed. And that's a big challenge going into 2022, but an exciting one, and our community is full of energy to get that done. That's it. That's it for me. I'm going to hand over the screen share to Anna for our next stage, a group discussion with a smiley face.